can hardly see a seat that's open. That is really encouraging. We are incredibly happy to have our visitors, our guests here with us today. We're super happy to see our snowbirds returning. So it's a joy to have you all back to worship God and be reunited as a family again. I want to talk to you about a pretty difficult subject today. And I think really the meaning behind this lesson, or the importance of this lesson, is mostly just learning to be aware of how to deal with grief when it happens to you, like when you lose a spouse, a child, someone super close to you, could be your best friend. How to understand what you're going to feel so it's not a shock, so it's not an absolute surprise, so it's not incredibly devastating as it often is to so many people. And not only that, but also to help you as an individual understand what someone else is going through so you can really be the kind of support system they need, so you're not taking a shot in the dark as what to say or do. Psalm 40 and verses 1 and 2, the first part of verse 2, it says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and He heard my cry. He lifted me out of the pit of destruction, out of the miry clay." And that is the title of this morning's lesson, Out of the Miry Clay. For those of you who've lost loved ones, you probably noticed how everyone seems to think they've got all the answers for you as to your struggles. When you lose a loved one, there will always be people who are quick to offer advice. They'll say things like, "It gets better with time." And although there may be some truth to that, sometimes such sayings don't heal in the moment. They don't really help. They'll say things like, "Just stay real busy and it won't hurt so much." Or, "You're just going to have to get over it." Or, "You're just going to have to learn to live with it." They may even say, "Come on, man, just snap out of it." I wish it were that easy. Don't you? I wish it were that quick and that easy as a snap. I don't do that very well. I have to use my thumb and my index finger. It doesn't happen that fast. Not at all. Grief is as complicated as each of us as individuals are complicated. Those who think grief can be reduced to a simple definition or a timeline of stages that you just check off or solved by worn-out cliches, well, it's likely that such people have never ridden this roller coaster of emotional pain before. There's always going to be an Eliphaz, a Bildad, or a Zophar. Some of you may say, "Those are weird names. Who are those guys?" You might remember those were Job's friends. Remember the guys that tried to comfort him, if you could call it that, or tell him why he was in such trouble? They weren't a lot of help, were they? Getting through the grief and beyond the miry clay is not easy, folks. And anyone that's lost someone close to them understands that very, very well. In Wilson Adams' book entitled, "Where is God When I Hurt?" he tells the story of a friend who had died rather suddenly, leaving behind a young wife and a couple of young daughters. Wilson said that he and his wife, Julie, took it upon themselves to call this young widow every Sunday evening and check on them. They did that for an entire year. One Sunday evening, Wilson recalled a response that the young widow gave him when he asked her how she and the girls were doing. The mom said, "The girls, they alternate between crying and being angry. They keep saying, 'It's not fair, Mommy.' They talk about how they've watched everyone else's lives go back to normal while they're stuck, while they're held captive by the tragedy of the loss of their daddy." Listen carefully, folks. Crying, anger, it's unfair, I feel stuck, I can't move, I feel held captive. Like many others, this poor mom and her two daughters are making their way through the maze of grief and discovering it's not easy and it's not a quick journey. The miry clay of Psalm chapter 40 and verse 2 is a picture of someone sinking lower and lower into a muddy like quicksand of depression. When will I get over this? a widow might ask herself? It's a simple question, yet it's a very, very complex answer. The reason it's so complex is because we're so complex. Because each of us are uniquely designed by God. You see, there's no one-size-fits-all kind of script for grief. For example, a family who loses their 90-year-old grandpa to Alzheimer's is very different from a young wife who loses her husband to a freak accident just shortly after he leaves for work on a given day. Are there similarities? Sure there are. It doesn't matter if your relative's 90 or 16. To lose anyone is heartbreaking. There's all the memories, there's all the love, there's that dramatic void in your life. But because each situation and each person is different, the grief will also be quite different. And by the way, you never just get over it. Like we said earlier, that someone might try and give you that advice. You got to just get over it, man. You never just get over it, folks. You never just get over it. You can, however, with the help of God, family, and friends, move past it. But you never just get over it. A word of caution. If you think simply reading your Bible, being more prayerful, trying to maintain a good attitude through it all, if you think that that will make all the hurt go away when you lose somebody you love, I hate to say it, folks, but you're sadly mistaken. For one thing, you don't forget the person for whom you grieve. You don't forget them. Sure, feelings may be tempered by time, and, more good memories than bad may start to become more prominent as time goes on. There will be days when all of us take one step forward. We really think we're heading towards that healing, but then something happens that triggers a thought, and all of a sudden, we fall 3 steps back. And it doesn't take all that much to do that. It could be you walk into a restaurant and you hear a song that your husband or your wife loved. It could be that you go to an art gallery and you see a picture on the wall and it brings back a flood of memories. Something in it triggers a memory from your past with that person you lost. It could be you pick up the phone and on the other line someone's voice sounds a whole lot like your spouse. And it just shuts you down for a minute. Raw emotions come out of nowhere. And they take us back to a place that we thought we had left behind. That's when we look in the mirror and we ask ourselves 2 questions. Number 1, is what I'm feeling and what I'm going through normal? And the answer is yes. And number 2, am I going crazy? The answer is no, you're not. Everybody goes through these things when they lose someone that they love. It's painful, and it doesn't just go away. There's not a cure-all, as we said moments ago. Again, why are we talking about this? Because we need help. We need help in dealing with it when it happens to us, because it's going to happen if it hasn't already. And we're going to need help in helping others, because that has happened already. And we need to be there for one another. We need to know the right things to do and the right things to say. We need to understand what people are going through, whether they're a man or a woman, whether they're old or whether they're young. We need to understand those things. It helps us to be better servants of better use to the Lord. Now I jumped the gun here. Let me talk about a couple of hardcore facts when it comes to those who grieve. There's no completion date. There's no completion date. In other words, it's not like in 1 month you're going to be fine. Everything's going to go back to normal. It doesn't work that way with the grieving process. We don't, of course, like to hear that because we expect everything to be nice and neat, orderly and organized. But grief doesn't work that way. That's not the reality of grief, my friends. Life doesn't always go according to plan, including the way we think grief should go. And so be patient with yourself when you're going through the loss of someone that you love. And make sure that you're incredibly patient with others who are going through it as well. That's number 1. A second fact is, men and women, generally speaking, handle grief differently. Men and women handle grief differently. And of course, this is generally speaking, but we handle it differently. And most men have a tendency to, of course, bottle up their feelings on the inside and keep their emotions more so to themselves. When men get together to cheer up my brother, as the song says, they might meet up at the greasiest hamburger joint in town. What do they talk about while glancing casually at the ESPN TV monitors overhead? Well, for the next hour or so, as they're sitting there scarfing down their burger, they discuss such emotional issues as hunting, fishing, football, and NASCAR. That's what men do. And after that, it's time to go. So much for compassion, right? Now, you might get a pat on the back, a handshake that's hearty. You may even get a hug from a male friend. But that's not a real common thing among men, to show a lot of compassion, to show a lot of empathy one for another. On the other hand, women are far more expressive with their feelings. When women get together to comfort a grieving sister, they might begin a conversation by exchanging, compliments like, "I just love your new purse," or "Where'd you get those awesome shoes?" And then after that time of pleasantries, someone invariably asks the question, "How are you feeling? How are you dealing with this?" And of course we know then tears almost invariably start to flow. And the beautiful thing about women is the compassionate empathy comes forward big time from all sides. There's embraces, there's encouragement. If they've gone through the same thing before, there's that comparison. I know what you're going through. There's just, women are better than that. Women are better at that than guys. The point here is simple though, folks. Because we're so different, we handle grief differently. So don't expect the same response from everybody. Don't harass someone into letting it all out or hurrying up and moving on. I have literally witnessed people at funerals look over and not see one of their relatives crying and shake their head like, "I can't believe they're not crying." Like have a bad attitude towards them because they're not showing the kind of emotion that one might expect at a funeral. I've heard people get frustrated with a relative who even a week or two later still hasn't cried about the loss of a spouse or a friend or a grandpa or a mom or dad. Everybody handles grief differently. People express it differently. Some people are very emotional and they'll go on expressing that for long periods of time. Some people don't show much at all. Some people, a month goes by and then all of a sudden they just totally break down. I remember when my dear uncle lost my aunt, and I didn't see much of a physical reaction from him, but he told me that he was grieving big time. And he said he tagged on tons of extra hours at work because it was the only thing that could keep his sanity, just having to be busy all of the time. People deal with grief in different ways. So don't hold them to some picture of what you think it should be and then treat them harshly in some way, shape, or form for not meeting what you see as your criteria for how they ought to react. So the fact is, people, most of us have very little experience dealing with death and the grief associated with it. And so we got to tread very lightly when we're talking with people, when we're trying to comfort people. So because of our minimal experience, we often say and do ignorant things. And I use that word ignorant in its truest sense, people. It's not a derogatory term. It simply means unknowing. We just don't know. Okay? So we often say and do things unknowingly how to do it in a good way. And we say and do things that hurt and frustrate the grieving party more so than help them. Hence, the single most helpful thing that you can do is just to be quiet, is just to be a good listener and be present to comfort the person who's grieving. Hold their hand, hug them, and don't let go. You let them pull away when they're ready. Hold their hand, tell them you love them, tell them that you're constantly praying for them. These things may sound really simple, They don't cost any money. They're not some kind of big extravagant task where you're going out to try and prove that you care for them. No, it's very simple, but nonetheless, folks, it's what most people desire when they're grieving the loss of a loved one. Be there. Don't stop being there. Embrace love, hold their hand, listen. Simple things, but the remedies that really work. You know, and I think back to what those little girls said to Wilson. When we lose somebody we love, and I know you've experienced this, those of you who have lost someone that you love, life grinds to a halt. It does. Everything kind of stops, and then every conversation and every activity relates back to that loss, back to that void in our lives. We feel like we're in a perpetual time warp. We feel like we are stuck, like we're in some kind of emotional jail. Sadly, the tragedy becomes our entire point of reference, and it begins to define who we are. Adding to the misery is the fact that close friends and family members, they seem to pull away after a certain amount of time, visiting with you less and less when we need them most. Reality check. Hurting people often see this as the great injustice of loss. They conclude, and sometimes mistakenly so, sometimes they're right, that their friends or family are uncaring and lack the proper amount of compassion. Yet the reality is this in most cases, folks. Their friends recognize a very hard truth. And that is that the grieving often don't recognize this hard truth. That truth is that life doesn't stop. It moves on. And God, of course, made it to move on as a way to actually help us move on and begin to heal. You can't stay stuck in that original state of being. You've got to move forward. Now, you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief, especially those of you that might have taken like psychiatry or psychology or things like that in college. Some of you that have studied this as nurses or doctors. Those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They say that basically everybody that loses someone they love go through some form of these 5 stages. I'm going to talk to you for the remainder of our time about 3 of these stages. Let's talk a little bit about denial. Denial. I can't believe this has happened to me. This all just seems like a bad dream. Maybe if I go to sleep and I wake up, it won't be real. You ever thought that, those of you that have lost someone that you've loved? Maybe it's not real. Denial is where the sorrowful journey begins. However, because we must eat and make a living, we're forced to accept the shock of reality and move forward. There are some, however, who prolong the denial stage by turning their home or a room in their home to basically a type of museum of memories. In their attempt to keep everything as it once was, they're actually prolonging the trap of the muddy mire. While denial may be the birthplace of grief, folks, it must not be the final resting place. You know, odd as it may seem, respect for the one that we've lost is actually best seen when we give ourselves permission to move on. Let me ask you something. Those of you that have lost a child or a spouse or a really good friend or a parent, most of you, if you really thought about what they'd say to you right now from beyond the grave, if they were able to speak to you from heaven's gates, what would they say? They'd say, move on. It's okay. I'm doing fine. You move on. Don't be stuck in this grief. I want you to be happy. Don't you think that's what they'd say? I believe with all my heart that's what they would say. Move on. Move on. Find happiness once more. I'm all right. Deuteronomy 34 and verse 5. The announcement comes to the Hebrews that their leader Moses has died. And so it says, so the sons of Israel wept for Moses 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses, they came to an end, as it says there in verse 8. God knew, folks, the importance of allowing His people time to grieve. And He gave them that time. You see, the trouble with us as Americans is we want everything to happen really fast. We're a fast food culture, and it bleeds into everything that we do. We want to rush the natural process of grief and everything else. For example, a loved one passes away on a Monday. 2 days later, we have the funeral, followed by a potluck dinner back at the spouse's home, where everybody shares a few fond memories of the person that's been lost, and then everybody's on to their lives again. A day or two later, everybody's back at work doing everything as if nothing had happened. And we think that's normal. It's not normal. Definitely not normal for the person that lost somebody. You're not going to turn around like that. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. God knows we need time to grieve. And so I say take the time to grieve. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to cry. Whether you're a man or a woman, it's okay to cry. It's okay to tell people out loud what you're feeling, what specifically is troubling you. To do so, folks, helps and heals. People need to express. People think this sounds funny, but how many times have you heard people say, I just needed a good cry? It helps. It brings healing. It really, really does. After denial, the second stage of grief is anger. And as Christians, we don't really like that word. There's almost a part of us internally that says, I can't ever be that way. But it's okay to be angry. Angry and not sin. The Bible makes it clear that it's okay to be angry. Why do we have anger? Because God built it within us. It is a natural emotion built within. It, of course, needs to be controlled at times, but it's built into us by God. After losing a loved one, it's very common for people to be mad. They go through that denial phase when they've really realized this has really happened. I can't deny it anymore, and I don't like it. And they get mad. And they don't just get mad at themselves. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I could have done something different. They get mad at God. A lot of people get mad at God. Even Christians get mad at God. How could you do this to me, God? Nobody else has this problem that I know of. And now for the rest of my life, I've got to live single. At least for a time, until I could heal and even consider marrying again. But then you think of those families where it's the breadwinner that's died. Now I got to totally change my whole life. I got to go back to school. I got to get a job. What a mess. People get mad. But it's okay. It's okay to get angry. And anger, as we said, is a natural God-given emotion. But we must exercise caution and handle it with care. Ephesians 4:26 and 27 says, Be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Other versions say, don't give the devil a foothold. You know what that means, don't you? You ever got a foothold on something? You know, so you could really dig it out of the ground. You had a foothold like on your shovel to really push it down in. You know, it's like getting a grasp on something. Notice that this last phrase, the greatest door of opportunity or foothold that we can ever give Satan, is to harbor anger and refuse to let it go. You see, the longer you hold on to anger, the greater the impact for damage on you. Not on God, not on maybe someone else you blame for what happened to your loved one, but on you. Each of us has a choice as to how long we're going to nurse our anger. If you're angry with God, I want you to understand that He knows your heart. He knows what you're going through. He lost His Son on a cross where He was crucified to death. I highly doubt any of us in this room will ever have to suffer such a tragedy with our spouse or friends or relatives. Such a horrific way to see a loved one pass. It hurts no matter what. But don't you dare say God can't understand what you're going through, because He can. He knows your heart. And so I challenge you that when you hurt, you go into your closet, you get on your knees, and you tell Him how you hurt. You lay your heart out for Him. You lay out your tears before Him at His feet, because He can't help you, folks, until you open up to Him. Revelation 3:20, here's a picture of Jesus. It's a famous picture that we have often seen. It says, "Behold, I stand at the door and I knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I'll come into him, and I will sup with him, and he with me." You've got to hear Him. You've got to be willing to hear, and you've got to be willing to open the door. He's not coming in unless you invite Him. If you want God's help if you want God's help to overcome your grief, you've got to invite Him in. You've got to ask for His help. You've got to get past that anger. Holding on to anger and refusing to release it, it's akin to holding a burning coal in your hand, and then the more you squeeze it, the more you are the one getting burned. Another stage of grief, what is often referred to as the fourth stage of grief, is depression. And we're going to talk about this one in even greater detail tonight as we take a look at the life of Elijah. But depression is a pit of overwhelming helplessness. Psalm 119:25 says, "My soul cleaves to the dust." That's Hebrew poetry for stating that life cannot get any lower than this. I cleave to the dust, to the dirt, to the mud. Some of God's greatest servants battled depression. Again, people don't like to think of that. They don't like to think of these godly men battling depression. They think that's a sign of weakness or something. I'm telling you, people, some of the greatest servants of our Lord battled depression. Moses, Hannah, Jeremiah, David, and Elijah, for starters. And we could go on and on. Some of God's greatest servants, some who are in the, as they call it, the heroes of faith chapter in Hebrews, battled depression. And I'll tell you, folks, if Psalm chapter 88 isn't painting a picture of depression, then I'm at a loss for what it's talking about. Psalm 88 and 1 through 5. In verse 1 it says, "I cried day and night." Verse 2 says, "I'm praying continually. My soul is troubled." Verse 3, "I am in the pit." The first part of verse 4, "and I have no strength." The latter half of verse 4. Verse 5 ending, "I feel like a walking dead man." Is that how you felt when you lost someone you loved? I'd reckon to say it is. Does it sound familiar to you? People of Scripture, some, as I said moments ago, heroes of faith, had their pit time, if you will, then why would we be surprised when you and I go through something similar? Depression is like an emotional superglue, and it's so easy to get stuck in it and very hard to get out of it. Some people actually need medical help. Some people need medical help to conquer their depression. And guess what, folks? That's perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with that at all. Sometimes Christians view, physicians who treat the mind with a raised eye of suspicion. Like, these guys are a bunch of quacks. We call them names like shrinks and other things. We make fun of them. Some people do. We're quick to counter with, "You don't need a shrink. You just need to read your Bible and pray more." As if that is the quick and easy cure-all for everything. Let's make something very clear. The Bible, which is of course God talking to us, and prayer, which is you and I talking to God, is the cure-all to life's struggles. I'm not meaning to make light of it at all in what I'm saying. But sometimes the mind becomes in such a state of imbalance that it actually requires medical attention. I know this is a newer territory than so many other medicinal means, but nonetheless, I believe that in the past 20, 30 years especially, we have come to some pretty strong conclusions that one can indeed, truly, sincerely, medically be imbalanced and have problems that need medical attention. For example, I'm going to compare a problem of the mind with what we see as a very common problem with the body. You wouldn't tell an accident victim lying in the middle of the road with a broken leg, a compound fracture, mind you, that all he needs to do is read his Bible and pray and he'll be fine. That just sounds ludicrous, doesn't it? You wouldn't say that. You understand that he needs immediate medical help to get him in the place where ultimately he can be healed and focus his attention on something like reading his Bible and prayer. The same principle is true with those who have a broken and bruised mind. God has provided man with some wonderful discoveries in the fields of science and medicine to help lift us up from the valley of despair. Instead of criticism, we need to be praising God, thanking God for what He has allowed us to discover in this kind of new frontier. In closing, folks, I hope the things that I've shared with you today, I pray that they'll help you when you lose a close loved one. I pray that they'll help you to better understand the grieving process and what to expect. And I also pray that what you've heard today will better help you to understand what a loved one is going through after losing someone dear to them. May it indeed better help you and me know where they're coming from and how to be of a greater help and comfort to them.